Hey there, everyone. That sexy nerd is back again, and we're watching Outlaw King History Buffs. So this is a movie, I believe, on Robert the Bruce. I have not seen it. I really did almost see it, though. I should have. You know, when you're on Netflix and you're like, oh, I kind of want to watch that, and then, whoa, what's this? You know, it's one of those moments. I started watching some of it, but I can't remember exactly what was happening. I think it was like some famous siege going on in the beginning. That's all I saw. I only saw a little bit of it. I really do have to watch it because Robert the Bruce really is an interesting character, and I'm sure this movie is a more accurate Braveheart. Well, I don't think William Wallace. Probably William Wallace doesn't even show up in this movie, but who knows? I guess we'll see. Let me know if you want me to do this movie in the comments, because again, I could still, you know, they're not gonna let. I still want to do Last of the Mohicans, and I still want to do some other movies. So I could probably do that. Maybe I'll even start a new channel and watch history movies and stuff like that. But you gotta let me know in the comments. But you know, anyway, let's just get into the video. And remember, please smash that like button if you want to see more sexy and nerdy content, and subscribe if you think I deserve it. Now let's do this thing, y'all.
Welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and today we'll be following an ambitious upstart as he aims to take the mantle from his popular predecessor. That's right, I'm talking about Outlaw King. Several years ago, I reviewed the 1995 epic Braveheart, a movie about the famous Scottish folk hero William Wallace, who fought the English in the First Scottish War of Independence. A beloved classic for many, but for me, it is one of the most historically inaccurate movies of all time.
Yeah.
I mean, where do I start? Kilts 300 years too early, Catholic Scotsmen painting their faces blue like their pagan ancestors, a humble farming background for a medieval noble, and a completely made-up affair with Queen Isabella, who was 9 years old and living in France at the time. There isn't even a bridge at the Battle Stirling Bridge.
Like, seriously. Edward II, like, already is one of the most maligned English kings of all time, and he really wasn't even that bad. He's just weak. He was just weak.
Fortunately, in its role as the unofficial sequel to Braveheart, Outlaw King aims to be a much more accurate portrayal of Scottish history, which is great because the truth is dramatic enough. Between 1296 and 1328, Scotland fought tooth and nail for freedom from English tyranny, and from 1306 that cause was embodied in the legendary Robert the Bruce, the Scottish king declared an outlaw by England. From stabbings in churches to noble last stands against overwhelming odds, there's plenty to work with. But does Outlaw King do it justice? And is it a good movie? Well, in this review, I'll be diving into the historical record and comparing it to the events of the film, whilst commenting on the quality of the filmmaking along the way.
I didn't think they'd show that whole thing where he stabs his rival in a church. The guy gets excommunicated for it. I thought they'd be like, oh, we'll just show that or tell that in post or passing or something like that. I hate when people do when movies do that. Movies and TV shows do that. Game of Thrones did that in the later seasons. It's ridiculous.
So without further ado, this is Outlaw King.
Woo! A royal mess.
So when Outlaw King begins, the opening titles right away state that this film is based on historical events. But unfortunately, we do get our first inaccuracy 2 seconds later when it says Scotland's king, Alexander III, died with no direct heir, which isn't true. It also conveniently forgets to mention that there was another Scottish king after Alexander III, and before the movie's dated year 1304. Which seems like it might at least be worth noting, especially since he was still very much alive. Now, obviously a short opening text like this can't give a full explanation, and so some condensing is inevitable, but this is why we're here. So what really happened to the run-up to 1304, before the siege of Stirling Castle? To understand that, we have to go back to the squally night of March 18th, 1286, when after feasting at Edinburgh Castle, Alexander III decided to travel to Kinghorn, where his queen was staying. It was already late and the weather was turning foul. In the dark, the king was separated from his squires. Their horses instinctively took the right road, his did not. While navigating a cliff edge in the fog, it stumbled, and the king was thrown from the saddle, breaking his royal neck. With it went the stability of the Scottish kingdom. Why? Well, 5 years earlier, Alexander's youngest son David died at the age of 8. 2 years after that, his daughter Margaret died in Norway, giving birth to a girl. Finally, in 1284, his eldest son, also called Alexander, died childless. That left the king with no male heir, and no female had ever inherited the throne of Scotland. So the survival of Alexander's line relied on the controversial coronation of his granddaughter Margaret, also known as the Maid of Norway.
Yes.
And she was only 3 years old at this point. Everything hung in the balance. Enter
this.
Robert Bruce. No, not that one. His grandfather, Robert V, also known as Robert the Competitor, and for good reason. In 1219, the competitor's father, Robert IV, married Isabel of Huntingdon, the second daughter of King Alexander II's brother, David. So when his queen died childless, Alexander II named Robert Bruce V as his direct heir. But this was just for insurance, and soon enough, the king found a new wife and produced a son, Alexander III. The arrival of a son ruined Bruce's claim. But when Alexander III died heirless in 1286, the now elderly Bruce moved quickly. At Parliament, he argued that no female could inherit the throne of Scotland, and that he should take it instead.
Ah, look at that. That reminds me of the Council of what is it? The Council in Game of Thrones that that stated that females shall not inherit the throne. Very interesting. It's actually what led up to House of the Dragon.
John Balliol stepped up to contest, claiming primogeniture, which means the right of succession should go to the firstborn child. As grandson to David's first daughter Margaret, Balliol was the eldest male of the nearest line. Sensing danger, the gathered nobles agreed to a compromise. 6 guardians would govern for the community of the realm, 3 loyal to Bruce, 3 to Balliol, until a solution was found. For a while, it looks like that solution might be the King of England, Edward I. His power and international prestige would give legitimacy to any successor.
I don't think he was that old when he made this deal. I don't think he was that old. Wasn't he older during like Wallace's time? But whatever.
King of Norway asked him to intercede on his daughter's behalf. Edward agreed. He called the guardians to Salisbury to meet a Norwegian delegation, and there the Scots agreed to take Margaret as their queen. But all was not as it seemed, as Edward was secretly planning to marry her off to his son, Edward of Carnarvon, and take the Scottish crown by stealth. This scheme only fell apart when news arrived of Margaret's tragic death from illness en route to Scotland. Her passing threatened to plunge the kingdom into a bloody civil war. So in a desperate bid, Guardian William Fraser begged Edward to break the deadlock. Big mistake. The English king averted civil war, but subjugated Scotland in the process. Out of 13 potential claimants, he favoured John Balliol on the condition that he recognised English overlordship. The Scots had their king, but his crown was ultimately owed to England. John Balliol formally bent the knee in 1292. Edward immediately set about humiliating King John. Over and over again, he called him to court to answer for his apparently poor decisions. Then in 1294, Edward summoned his Scottish subjects to war with France. Instead, the Scottish lords pressed Balliol to ally with England's enemy.
The Scottish seemed to really love the French for some reason. They were like allies with them for so long.
Bruce the Competitor finally died at 75,
there he is.
an almost supernatural feat at the time, and his grandson, Robert the Bruce VII, the Robert the Bruce, married his first wife Isabella, and not long after she died giving birth to their daughter Marjorie. By the following year, Edward was at war with Scotland, so summoned to fight for England and locked out of the Scottish monarchy, the leftover Bruces declared for Edward. That's Bruce's 6th and 7th for those keeping count. At Carlisle Castle, they held off the Cummins, supporters and family of John Balliol. Meanwhile, Edward attacked Berwick, where his army slaughtered between 7,500 to 15,000 men, women and children. Finally, after a series of defeats, John Balliol surrendered, along with most Scottish nobility. In victory, Edward the Leopard confiscated the Stone of Scone, integral to Scottish coronation, and demoted Scotland to a land.
And it still wasn't returned until like 1996, I think, after Braveheart.
The Kingdom of Scotland was no more, and with it went the Bruce's claim to its throne. And that's when William Wallace enters the picture. Unlike most nobles, he refused to submit to Edward. Instead, he gathered a common army to continue the fight. Then, when Wallace moved to join forces with William Douglas, Edward dispatched Robert the Bruce to take Douglas Castle. Partway there, Bruce decided to switch allegiances and join the Scottish side, saying, "No man can hold his own flesh and blood in hatred. I must join my own people and the nation in which I was born." Now, Robert wasn't present at Wallace's stunning victory at Stirling Bridge on the 11th of September 1297. nor at his defeat at Falkirk on the 22nd of July, 1298, whatever Braveheart might have you believe. But, in the aftermath, Robert shared guardianship of Scotland with John Cummin. Which is a bit surprising since John the Red Cummin was nephew of John Balliol and Bruce's main rival while the king was in exile. This partnership wasn't built to last. In July 1299, Bruce's position was dealt a huge blow. News arrived that the Pope had helped secure John Balliol's release into papal custody. While he wasn't free yet, the chances of a Balliol return were improving, and that would leave Bruce out in the cold. Tensions rose, and by August, they bubbled over. At a meeting of patriots at Peebles, Cummin grabbed Bruce by the throat. If it hadn't been for the intervention of James Stewart, there easily could have been bloodshed. Then, in the autumn of 1301, the papacy handed Balliol over to the King of France, who promptly gave him his freedom. Robert saw the writing on the wall. There were no good outcomes for him in the Scottish camp. Either Edward would win and likely strip him of his lands, or John would return, thwarting Bruce's claim to the throne. In January 1302, the future hero of Scottish independence switched sides again to fight for England. It was a smart, ruthlessly pragmatic move. Through it, Bruce saved his earldom of Carrick and accessed English loans to feed his vassals. But Robert would also serve in the retinue of Edward Carnarvon, fight alongside Aymer de Valence, and help subjugate the Scots. He was even required to lead the hunt for William Wallace. Now, it's not surprising why the opening of Outlaw King avoids mentioning any of this. It makes the Bruce's later actions seem less cynical, and I imagine that's why it also misses out King John entirely. It's the same propaganda that Bruce supporting chroniclers recorded. It helps Bruce's claim to suggest that Balliol never happened, as the deposed king was still alive in exile, and his natural successor would have been his nephew, John Cummin, not Robert the Bruce. All that said, the basic shape of the conflict is there, and these are mostly omissions rather than outright misrepresentations. In any case, that pretty much sums up everything that happened prior to our movie, as we arrive at the siege of Stirling Castle.
I forgot who plays Edward the First.
In the opening scene of the movie, or should I say opening shot, since it almost goes on for 9 minutes, Outlaw King gets some big things right. One very big thing in particular. You might think that gigantic trebuchet is completely ridiculous, and you'd be right, but that's because it is accurately ridiculous. In the medieval equivalent of the nuclear option, King Edward assembled the largest collection of trebuchets the world has ever seen to take Stirling Castle. Chief among them was the Loup de Guerre, French for werewolf, a reminder that the kings of England at this time spoke French.
Yes, the kings of England did speak French. Technically, France owned England. Not really. It was weird. It's because they declared themselves their own kings and everything, but technically the kings of England for a really, really long time until I believe Henry the Fourth. Yeah, Henry the Fourth, until Henry the Fourth came in and he declared it English. Even though, again, I'm always pissed when everybody says that that Richard III was the last Plantagenet king, and I'm like, no, he wasn't. No, he was not. Richard II was. Richard II was the last Plantagenet king. He was the last French-speaking king. So what the hell? I don't know. Somebody needs to explain that to me in the comments.
The werewolf was, to put it simply, massive. It was said that it could hurl a 300-pound boulder, and since trebuchet counterweights were 100 times heavier than the projectile, the werewolf may have weighed as much as 15 tons.
Wow.
And Edward had the lead roofs of churches from as far as St. Andrews and Perth melted down to make it. Faced with that kind of destructive power, you can't blame the Stirling garrison for surrendering. But to Edward that was unacceptable, and so he ordered them back into the castle.
Lord Oliphant tried to surrender 2 days ago. Edward refused to accept.
Wants to be certain we get the message.
Yeah, but that's not really why, is it?
Everyone needs to understand that this surrender is final.
Like the Greek fire!
Also, it took 3 months to build, so I don't want to waste it.
Greek fire?
That's more like it. Nobles and commoners had travelled from all over the kingdom to witness the werewolf in action, and the cost of building it had been eye-watering, so nothing was going to stop Edward from showing off his new toy.
How does he have Greek fire?
And as for his comment to light the Greek fire, invented by the Byzantines, the ingredients of the flammable mixture known to crusaders as Greek fire are unknown to this day. What we do know is that it acted similarly to napalm and could be thrown in pots. There is some evidence that the English barrage at Stirling Castle included some fiery projectiles, but we don't know for certain what form these projectiles took, or if the Warwolf launched any of them. Documents record the king asking his treasurer to provide cotton, sulfur, and saltpeter for the siege, and saltpeter is otherwise known as potassium nitrate, one of the major constituents of gunpowder.
Just a little thing before we continue. Let's just say, for all you fans of Game of Thrones out there, there's a lot of connections to Game of Thrones here. But, you know, obviously Greek fire is what inspired wildfire in Game of Thrones.
I remember reading an old sailor's proverb. Piss on wildfire and your cock burns off.
Oh.
While I doubt that the king would have risked setting his pride and joy alight on his first shot, it's not impossible, and it definitely would have added to the spectacle. Regardless of whether it was hurling rocks or pots, the Warwolf scored a direct hit and demolished the entire wall of the castle like wet paper. Speaking of spectacle, we are also treated to an impromptu duel between Robert and Edward Carnarvon, the Prince of Wales. But more than likely this duel never happened, and the interaction is done for the sake of drama and for exposition. That said, it has been suggested that Robert might have entered into Edward I's household for a couple of years in 1291, which does lend a bit more believability to this exchange.
Do you remember our summers at Westminster, when I was a little boy? Our foot races, dueling with wooden swords.
Overall, this just looks like an attempt to establish some personal stakes, and to add a little spice to the final epic showdown, which is also made up, but we'll get to that later. In the meantime, a bit of light timeline shuffling is in progress at dinner.
Finally, Sir Richard de Burgh, valiant marshal, loyal servant of the crown.
Your Grace.
We give the hand of your daughter Elizabeth, my goddaughter,
Is that Stannis?
to Sir Robert de Bruce.
The thing is, it would have been difficult for the king to give his blessing to this marriage at Stirling, because in real life, he'd already given it 2 years before. Elizabeth and Robert were married in 1302, possibly in Canterbury, when she was aged just 13 and Robert 28. Interestingly, that makes the age gap between Florence Pugh and Chris Pine spot on. Now, obviously their real ages wouldn't have worked to the film's romance angle. Essentially though, this was a political union and not uncommon at the time. Also out of place and time is Robert's father, who died in March, well before the siege of Stirling. But it is true that he remained outwardly loyal to the English though, helping to take the edge off of his son's defection.
I'm proud of you, Robert.
That's Stannis.
You had the courage to stand up to me, and the wisdom to stand down.
I recognize him.
Well done for bringing your son round, Rob.
With him gone, Robert the Younger was already putting a plan in motion to betray Edward again. He slipped out of the camp to a secret meeting with Bishop Lamberton of St. Andrews. Now, we don't know exactly what was discussed, but it's not tough to guess. It almost certainly centered on the failing health of the English king. Edward's death would be the opportunity for a Bruce ascendancy, but for that to happen, Robert would need the backing of the Scottish Church. The two agreed to mutual support. However, Outlaw King skips over this meeting entirely, probably because the film wants to give him some time to form some grievances first. Top among them, the brutal execution of William Wallace.
We swore vows on King Edward's Bible that we will need to break.
Why, what happened?
Wallace is dead. The people are up in arms.
I would imagine they are.
There can be no peace.
That's a bit rich coming from the guy who chased Wallace into Selkirk Forest on King Edward's behalf. Now, maybe his heart wasn't really in it, and he wasn't directly involved in the final capture, despite what we see in Braveheart, but he could hardly have been all that surprised at Wallace's death, even if it was excessively and unjustly violent. Having never sworn an oath to the English king, Wallace was no traitor, yet he infamously received a mock trial and a traitor's death. On the 23rd of August 1305, he was cruelly drawn, hanged, disemboweled, castrated, and eventually decapitated. His head was then displayed on London Bridge, his right arm in Newcastle, his left arm in Berwick, his right foot in Perth, and his left foot in Stirling, making this image brutally accurate, minus Bruce being present for the unveiling. Now, what happened next remains contentious to this day. In fact, there is no way of knowing for certain how accurate the movie is because no one can even agree on the history. What we do know is that Bruce and John Cummin met at the Church of the Greyfriars in Dumfries on the 10th of February, 1306. 2 men walked in, only one walked out. Other than that, almost nothing is absolute.
We can't trust Common.
It's sacred ground, Angus.
Still don't like it.
Every historical account has some form of bias, but from what exists, there is a most likely scenario. In it, Bruce met Cummin at the altar and told him his plan to become King of Scotland.
It doesn't involve you in it.
Robert may even have offered his family's lands in exchange for Jon's support.
We already tried it for 8 bloody years, and we failed.
Because we didn't unite.
No, because your family were too busy trying to claim a crown that wasn't theirs.
Their conversation became heated, then devolved into violence, and not for the first time. Remember their disagreement in Peebles, when Cummin grabbed Robert by the throat? This is the reason why a church was chosen for this meeting, as violence was expressly forbidden on holy ground. Wow. Despite this, in the heat of the moment, Robert pulled out his dagger and stabbed Cummin. When the dust settled, the future king had murdered his main rival in cold blood, in a church no less. For a conversation that remains unclear to this day, Outlaw King's interpretation of it is entirely reasonable, although maybe a bit too kind to Bruce. For instance, he probably used his own dagger to do the actual stabbing instead of pinching Jon Cummin's. After all, we do know that both men came to the church armed. Also, the movie implies that the killing was totally spur of the moment, but Bruce would have known this was a possibility. It's not a stretch to say that he may have even planned for the eventuality.
No shit.
Regardless, he definitely had to come up with a plan to deal with the fallout, because Scotland would be at war once again.
Yeah, and then he was excommunicated.
Bruce and his men immediately pushed west, seizing the castles of Tibbers, Dalswinter, Dumfries and Ayr. On top of this, Robert summoned nobles to his cause and had messengers and preachers mobilise the local populace. Most importantly, he rode to Glasgow to meet Bishop Wishart, a long-time Bruce supporter. If the Scottish Church didn't accept him after a sacrilegious act, his attempt would be dead in the water, and wouldn't be long before he was too. Luckily for Robert, the bishop heard his confession and absolved him of his crime.
Oh, really?
Cummin was gone, and a balliol return now seemed impossible. So it was Bruce or bust. And bust would mean total English domination of the Scottish Church.
The answer is clear, is it not? If you vow to support the church, we will support your inauguration as our king.
Between Wishart and Lamberton, Robert now knew he could count on the support of the bishops of Scotland. In return, he gave a solemn commitment to protect the independence of the Scottish Church and reclaim the sovereignty of the Scottish kingdom. The church in Rome, however, saw things differently and excommunicated Bruce for his actions. The reception in England was equally frosty, but it didn't arrive immediately as implied in the movie. At first, reports were confused and incomplete. Edward knew by the end of February that Cummin was dead, but not who killed him, so he sent 2 friars north to clear it up. In the meantime, the Bruce party made for Scone to prepare for his inauguration. Near the hill of Erixton, they met a mysterious man.
What is your business? Halt! I said halt!
Oh.
My lord, I'm James, son of William Douglas of Douglasdale.
Really?
I recognize your father in you.
This may seem odd, but James Douglas really did dismount his horse and kneel down in the road before introducing himself. In fact, he was pretty odd in general, although he wouldn't say that to his face. His father, William Douglas, had fought alongside Wallace and died an English prisoner in 1299, leaving James stripped of his estate. It was William whose castle Bruce had been sent to attack by Edward back in 1296, before he switched sides for the first time. Back then, Robert decided to fight alongside Douglas instead. Now he was happy to accept the man's son into his service. With what he was about to do at Scone, he would need all the help he could get. But Robert was far from the only one putting everything on the line. The royal crown of Scotland had been confiscated by Edward back in 1296, along with the Stone of Destiny. So it's hugely symbolic that Isabella of Fife, Countess of Buchan, took part in the coronation ceremony. According to ancient custom, the crown was to be placed on a new king's head at Scone by the Earl of Fife. But since he was 16 and a ward of the English king, his aunt performed the ritual. This meant leaving her husband, the Cummin supporting Earl of Buchan, forever. So it's a great personal risk. For her, like for King Robert and his queen consort, there would be no going back.
God bless the King of Scots.
King of Scots.
Your Majesty.
Which is why I really love this shot. The camera leaves the king at his crowning moment to follow the Countess, which I think does justice to how important she was to the legitimacy of the whole event. I'm not sure how deliberate it is, but it's a really great touch. Meanwhile, back in England, when Edward heard what Robert was up to, he completely lost his rag.
I am so sick of Scotland!
To the increasingly ill Edward I, Robert the Bruce was not just guilty of treason and murder, but also of unforgivable ingratitude. After all, Edward had shown uncharacteristic mercy in 1302 by restoring Bruce's lands and even allowing him to marry his goddaughter. This time, there would be no mercy.
Stannis.
As a prelude to war, on the 22nd of May, 1306, Edward knighted his son, Edward of Carnarvon, in the church at Westminster Palace.
The only thing is, I think he's a little too short. I don't think he's 6 foot, like, Edward the Longshanks was famously. He was famously 6 foot or something, and which was monstrous back in those days.
In the movie, the king also goes on to knight 297 other men, but this job was actually given to Carnarvon at the larger Westminster Abbey. In any case, it was the largest mass knighting in medieval England. Maybe even more impressive was the feast that followed the ceremony, the highlight of which was the arrival of 2 swans. Now, it's not clear whether these were gold cast or living swans, but if they were alive, they are said to have either been trapped between a mesh of gold chains or in golden cages. Dead or alive? The film can't decide, so it just does both. Either way, Edward swore on the swans to avenge the death of John Cummin, whereas in the movie, it's his son who does this instead.
By these swans, I vow to avenge this murderous insult to God!
The event became known as the Feast of the Swans. Back in April, the king had appointed Aymer de Valence, the Earl of Pembroke, to command the English forces in the east. In a rare move, he also ordered Valence to raise the Dragon Banner, suspending the rules of chivalry and traditional conventions of war. In reality, it may have been more of a windsock than a banner, but it meant that captured knights wouldn't be ransomed, they'd just be executed. Edward had had enough of mercy. And that seemed justified when the Archbishop of Canterbury announced Robert's excommunication on the 5th of June. 3 days later, Prince Edward rode out at the head of the king's army. The king himself followed more slowly behind, being quite ill by this point. Now, it's always nice to see a cameo from William Wallace's head, but I'm not so sure the army would have ridden over London Bridge like this, given that then they would have been heading south, famously the opposite direction to Scotland. Don't believe me? Have a look at this map of London from 1300. As you can see, there was very little on the south side of the river to be riding from. And yet we can see the city stretching out behind them. The number of spires alone is a dead giveaway. So if we accept that what's behind them is the northern bank, they must be riding the wrong way. But who knows, maybe they got confused. Aymer de Valence, on the other hand, was definitely going the right way. He was already in the north and by June had mustered 300 knights and 1,300 infantry.
Yeah, so what? They made that mistake. I mean, at least it's not as bad as Braveheart's stupid-ass mistakes.
More than double the number that Bruce managed to raise. As he travelled further into Scotland, Valence also captured Bishops Wishart and Lamberton. Wishart, for his part, defended Cupar Castle, quote, like a man of war. Lamberton instead surrendered, but only after directing his tenants to leave and join Robert. Both were sent south to be imprisoned. Had they not been clergy, they would have definitely been executed. When news reached Robert that Valence had taken Perth, he couldn't risk having his queen and her retinue with him anymore. He sent them north to Kildrummy Castle, under the protection of his brother Neil. Alongside Elizabeth went his daughter Marjorie, his 2 sisters, and the Countess of Buchan. All would be in terrible danger of caught, having pledged loyalty to an outlaw. Before she left, Elizabeth is supposed to have said, "I think you may be king of summer, king of winter you will not be."
Alas, we are but king and queen of the May. And tomorrow will come to strip us of our crowns.
Now, Elizabeth delivers the movie's version of this line at Methven on the eve of battle, but in real life, by that time, she was long gone, and good thing too, because Valence wasn't messing about. On the 18th of June 1306, Robert rode to the gates of Perth. There he challenged the Earl to either give up the castle or come out to fight. Valence agreed to give battle the following day, but definitely not one-on-one, as the movie says.
We can resolve this conflict by fighting one-on-one. Now.
I accept. But today is a Sunday. I know you don't much respect holy matters, but I do.
Tomorrow, then.
Aside from how risky this would have been, I was curious and decided to check my Julian calendar and found out that the 18th of June 1306 was actually a Saturday. So this delay would have been the exact opposite of godly, but now I'm definitely nitpicking. What's important is that the real arrangement was made for a pitched battle, not a duel on the 19th. But remember, the dragon banner was flying, and outlaws weren't owed honesty. So in the early hours of the morning, Valence lined his army in the border of the woods in Methven, where King Robert and his men were camped. At dawn, they charged, surprising Bruce's forces and cutting many of them down. The key word there is surprise, and that should tell you all you need to know about whether those fire arrows are accurate. I'm not sure if this is just another instance of this stupid trend in medieval movies to light every bloody arrow on fire, or if it's just so we could see what is going on in the scene. But fire arrows, even if they worked as intended, which they don't, would have completely given the game away, as in fact they do in the movie. When Valence's men attacked in real life, it was without warning, leaving the Bruce army with no time to regroup or mount an effective defense. The fighting was so chaotic that Bruce was almost captured by Philip de Mulberry. He was only saved by the bravery of Christopher Seton, who was later captured at Loch Doon and executed. Bruce was able to escape alongside his brothers, as well as James Doon and executed. Only saved by the bravery of Christopher Seton, who was later captured at Loch Doon and executed. Bruce was able to escape alongside his brothers, as well as James Douglas, Gilbert de la Haye, and some other close allies. Many more were killed or captured.
We had a red wedding up in here. Jeez.
Bruce isn't here! Kill all the prisoners! Let the Scots see what comes of pledging fealty to their new king.
What about Athol? He is an earl.
Take him to London, you bastard, Babs. The king will hang him for treason.
He's not wrong. Athol was the first earl to be executed in England for 230 years, but he wasn't captured in Methven, and the portrayal of Valence is a little uncharitable here. The Earl of Pembroke actually intervened to save some of the prisoners, including Thomas Randolph.
Really?
The sneak attack also wasn't his idea. It came from Ingram de Umfraville, a common partisan. That said, the result was no less brutal. All up, when Robert was able to regroup at Month in the northeast, he had fewer than 500 men remaining. His small army was gone.
"50 men to fight the strongest army in the world."
Whether it was 50 men or 500 wouldn't make much difference. Things were pretty bleak. Robert was already an outlaw and an excommunicate. Now he couldn't even claim to be a winner, and who but the most loyal would back a loser? As a generally pious man, Bruce would have wondered if this was God's punishment. One comfort was that Robert did manage to reunite with Elizabeth and her ladies before travelling to Loch Lomond, but as they fled further west, they were entering hostile territory, where before too long they ran into the forces of John MacDougall.
Comyn was my cousin. You're no king of ours.
Needless to say, he was no fan of Bruce's. His men launched Robert's party as they passed through a narrow gorge at Dalry. It was a terrifying assault, with MacDougall's men charging down the steep hillside, armed with Lahaba axes. Bruce's losses were severe. Among those left, many were wounded, including James Douglas and Gilbert de la Haye.
Angus! Look! MacDougall's!
Now the film shifts to the MacDougall attack to the shore of Loch Lomond, which Bruce and his men later crossed using a single half-sunken boat. But I think this attack is also combined with another battle which took place the following year, in February 1307. Skipping ahead, this was another disastrous encounter, this time with the MacDougall clan, not to be confused with the MacDougalls, although they were close allies. Robert sent two of his brothers, Alexander and Thomas, to counter the MacDougals at Loch Ryan. There, a force led by Dougal MacDougall attacked the Bruces as they landed on the beach. In the fierce fighting, Thomas and Alexander were captured and sent to Edward of Carnarvon, who promptly had them executed. Whereas in the movie, Alexander's killed in this scene instead, despite the fact that he lived into the following year. Now I can see how swapping out the gorge for a beach does provide some visual variety, and merging the MacDougalls with the MacDougalls does prevent some confusion. I mean, what's an extra G between friends? But in my opinion, the real MacDougall assault was spectacular enough. Plus, this was the battle where Elizabeth and Marjorie were actually present, convincing Robert to send them away to kill Drummy again.
Really?
A decision which would come to haunt him. Indeed, Edward Carnarvon and Valence soon arrived there and laid siege to the castle. Unlike in the movie, the gates weren't opened voluntarily. A traitor inside the wall set fire to the grain store, causing a blaze that forced the defenders to surrender. Luckily, by that time, they had already served their purpose. Elizabeth and her ladies had escaped north with the Earl of Athol. That's the same Earl of Athol who was captured at Methven in the movie, so you already know how this ends for him.
Oh no.
Nonetheless, thanks to his efforts, the ladies weren't captured to kill Drummy as shown. Unfortunately, Neil Bruce was, but he wasn't executed on the spot. He was taken to Berwick first. The result, though, was the same, and the film accurately shows just how bloody this punishment was. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered on the king's orders.
Your Highness, I swear! I swear I don't know! No, please, I swear. I swear.
It's a harrowing scene. Luckily, Elizabeth and Marjorie weren't there to see it like in the movie. They actually made it quite far north to Tain before they were seized by the Earl of Ross. In doing so, he ignored the rules of sanctuary, which should have allowed the Queen up to 40 days of safety at Garth of St. Duthic's shrine. Instead, Elizabeth was sent south to be imprisoned at the royal manor of Burstwick in Holderness. There she was given food and water by two women chosen specifically for their lack of humour. In the movie, Prince Edward also tries to convince her to annul her marriage to Robert, which she refuses to do, and I've been unable to find any evidence of this. What I can say for sure is that she definitely wasn't locked in a cage and suspended over the walls of Berwick.
I would imagine not.
It's not as ridiculous as it might seem.
What?
Remember Isabella Fife, the Countess who crowned Robert the Bruce? She and Bruce's sister Mary were actually kept in purpose-built cages. However, these were hung inside the tower rooms and had a small toilet. If they had been really left outside, they would quickly have died of exposure.
Yeah,
Plus,
exactly.
the cages were cruel enough as it is. They were tiny and offered no privacy. Fortunately, although a smaller cage was considered, the 10-year-old Marjorie was spared this fate. As depicted in the movie, she was instead moved to a convent.
No, come on, Marjorie. Please don't make this hard. Don't make it.
No, I don't want to go. No.
Marjorie, I'll see you soon. I promise. I promise. I promise. I love you.
Unfortunately, she wouldn't see Marjorie soon, nor her husband, who was unaware of what happened to kill Drummy. He pressed on. While Methven may have culled Robert's army to a warband, Dalry left no more than a bunch of fugitives. That 50 number starts to look much more realistic, if still a little on the low end. This helps explain why for that winter of 1306, Bruce's men effectively vanished from the record. That said, we do know they met up with Angus Og MacDonald of Ely at the Mull of Kintyre. He was a supporter of Bruce and sworn enemy of the MacDougals. Wow. Of course, an outlaw king, Angus has been with the party this whole time. The English soon caught wind of this and landed at Kintyre in September, but by then Bruce was gone, either to the island of Rathlin or somewhere along the Antrim coast. It is around this time that the famous legend of Robert and the Spider is said to have taken place. According to the story, Bruce was considering giving up, maybe even leaving on crusade. The weight of his failures and the people who had already died for his kingship were heavy on his conscience. Then a spider caught his eye. It was trying to spin its web between two beams. Later versions happen in a cave, so the beams are replaced with rock walls. 6 times it failed, but on the 7th attempt, it succeeded. He realized that victory was possible and that he should persevere.
I'll be ready. I'll be like the spider and its web.
The story is probably not true. The first reference to it seems to come from 1828, so I'm glad that the movie doesn't give too much time or weight to it. In fact, when Bruce says it in the movie, he's referencing the trap he's planning to set at Loudon Hill, so it's not even in context, but it's a great metaphor for Robert's resilience, and a well-known story, so I'm glad they chose to include a nod to it. Whatever drove him, Bruce spent the winter months touring the Isles, gathering resources, and recruiting as he went. If nothing else, Robert was persuasive.
No more taxes for Edward's pocket. No more good men dying in wars not of their making. We can unite Scotland. We can win her back.
Bruce used the time wisely to recover, regroup, and gather strength. By the end of January 1307, he was ready to return to the mainland. In the process, he made the fateful decision to split his forces, leading to the deaths of 2 of his brothers, as mentioned earlier. Robert's landing at Arran was less eventful, but if he thought the people of his home territories would rally to his cause, he'd be disappointed. The English had Carrick in an iron grip. On the other hand, this also left the English garrison at Turnberry complacent, so when Robert attacked at night, the Scots caught plenty of soldiers sleeping outside the castle walls.
Good.
The darkness also made it impossible to work out the size of the attacking force, so Sir Henry Percy kept the rest of his men inside as a precaution. From there, he could only listen to those outside being killed. Sadly, Robert did not pull a Trojan horse and cart to break into the castle, as funny as this image is. Instead, he gathered supplies from beyond the walls and left. Around this time, the king was also finally informed of the full scale of his losses. Christian of Carrick, a lover of Bruce's, you don't see that in the movie, came to see him. She told him the brutal deaths of his brothers Neil, Thomas and Alexander, as well as the capture of his wife and daughter. In Outlaw King, this job is given to Angus of Ely.
Kildrummy's fallen. Every man massacred. Your brother was hanged, drawn and quartered.
Oh.
My wife, my daughter.
They're both alive. Taken by the prince.
I could see why they chose not to complicate the romantic narrative, but there may be another reason. In the movie, this news serves as the emotional driving force behind Robert's decision to switch to guerrilla warfare, so it has to come earlier for that to make sense narratively.
No more chivalry. Now we fight like wolves.
Yes!
But historically speaking, chivalry wasn't really an option at this point anyway. Nonetheless, faced with English brutality and lessons from Turnberry, Robert decided to change strategy. From now on, they would destroy captured castles.
The poor horse. I know they're not really doing that, but what? They're aiming for the horse? Stop it!
And poison wells to keep them out of enemy hands. They would burn crops and use the land to exaggerate their numbers. A really good example of this was James Douglas's capture of Douglasdale, an attack which became known, jokingly, as the Douglas Larder. On Palm Sunday, the local English garrison left the safety of the castle to attend mass at the nearby church. During the service, Douglas and his men entered and decimated the unarmed soldiers while yelling, "Douglas, Douglas, Douglas!" So, amazingly, those crazy screams are completely accurate. But if anything, the real attack was even wilder. Finding the castle undefended, Douglas and his men ate the Palm Sunday feast prepared for the garrison. Then, after taking all the provisions they could carry, Douglas ordered the rest piled in the cellar. They then decapitated the prisoners and chucked them on top before setting the whole grisly heap on fire.
Revenge.
Finally, the well was poisoned with salt and the bodies of dead horses. Now, there's no evidence that anyone was dumped in there alive as suggested in the film, although I wouldn't put something like that past James Douglas. The English called him the Black Douglas for a reason, and I think this scene captures that very well, while also showing just how effective these guerrilla tactics could be. The only problem is that all this didn't happen until the 17th of April 1308, a year after the end of the movie, but I won't begrudge the filmmakers too much for that one since it's such a great scene. Plus, John Barber, the Scottish poet and chronicler, also incorrectly put the date of the event to 1307, so they're not the only ones who thought that date worked better narratively. The movie version also combines 3 assaults of the castle, since it was only after the 3rd attack that Douglas actually destroyed it as he left. You can understand his reluctance on the previous occasions, given that this was his ancestral home.
Loudon Hill?
By 1307, Edward sensed that Bruce was gaining ground, so the king wrote to Aymer de Valence, accusing him of hiding his failures. This pushed Valence to take the fight to Bruce, which he attempted to do at Glentrool in April. Valence sent Henry Clifford and John de Vaux to do the job, but they were outmaneuvered by Robert, who had positioned his men on the high ground. The Scots ambushed the English from above with rocks and arrows, quickly breaking their discipline. Now, I could see why the film skips over this since it was only a small skirmish, but for the Scots, it was huge. It's proved that the English weren't invincible and may have emboldened Bruce to challenge Valence to open battle, whereas in the movie, this decision seems to come from nowhere.
Best to wait, Robert. Gather our strength.
What the hell is that?
I'm done with running and I'm sick of hiding. We'll provoke them until they come after us.
In real life, no provoking was needed. Valence was more than happy to meet the Scots in open battle. But the film shows Edward taking a raid at Lochmaben very personally and riding up from London. Then, before he can arrive, illness finally takes him, leaving his son, now Edward II, to take over the campaign. And this is where the timeline meddling starts to get a bit out of hand. The truth is, Edward I did decide to deal with the Scots himself, but only after the Battle of Loudon Hill, the climax of the movie. The king also left from Carlisle, not London, before dying of dysentery in the arms of his servants. Legend says that on his deathbed, Edward made his son promise to carry his bones into battle.
If I die, you are to boil my body and carry my bones into every battle with the Scots until Robert the Bruce's head is on an English spike, you understand?
But this couldn't have happened as Edward Carnarvon was in London at the time. Then again, at least there is some character basis for it, unlike this.
Bury him here.
Why?
Shouldn't we honor his wishes?
No. You should honor mine.
I'm sorry, but this is bollocks. The former king's body was buried in a black marble tomb in Westminster Abbey. You can visit it today. Now, Edward II may have had plenty of reasons to dislike his father.
Definitely, I definitely like him, though, as Edward II. You know why? Because he reminds me a lot of Tywin in this movie. Like, I remember when I first saw Tywin in Game of Thrones, I was like, he seems very familiar. And I just thought of this guy from Braveheart. The guy who plays Edward here. He's fantastic. And yes, I like Stannis playing him, but he doesn't seem like history depicts him, you know?
Including the fact that his dad had exiled his favorite advisor and potential lover, Piers Gaveston. But that doesn't mean he would have been willing to just bury the King of England at the side of the road. More importantly, none of this happened before Loudon Hill anyway. So not only was Edward Carnarvon not king in time for the final battle, he wasn't even in Scotland. It was Aymer de Valence who received and accepted Bruce's challenge to fight on the 10th of May, 1307. And with the benefit of choice, Robert picked Loudon Hill for the boggy ground on either side.
Oh, my stomach.
He then ordered the digging of 3 concealed trenches. With only around 600 men under his command, he would need every advantage he could get. Valence's numbers are less clear, though they obviously outstrip Bruce's significantly.
Seems it's better for us both if this battle were to end swiftly.
It won't. With 3,000 mounted soldiers.
Yes, my portion of whom are to have a single aim. The man whom you've failed to capture.
3,000 is the number given by the chronicler John Barber, but is probably a significant inflation of the reality. What isn't in doubt is the advantage of cavalry, which Bruce lacked at this stage, hence the need for trenches and bogs designed to level the playing field by downing the enemy's horses. But no battle can start without an epic speech.
I could talk about God, but he has no place where we are going.
That's the closest, I think that's the closest that medieval people could be like meta.
The same would have been the case here. Actually, Robert the Bruce probably did talk about God, and he almost certainly thought that of all places, God would be on the battlefield. As historian Stephen Spinks puts it, this is an age where purgatory and hell were as real as Stirling Castle, and if you lost a battle, it was because God was not on your side. Now, no speech actually survives from the Battle of Loudon Hill, but one from the later Battle of Bannockburn does. And in that, Roberts won't shut up about God. He's quoted to have said the following: "For us, the name of the Lord must be our hope of victory in battle. This is a day of rejoicing, the birthday of John the Baptist. With our Lord Jesus as commander, St. Andrew and the martyr St. Thomas shall fight today with the saints of Scotland for the honour and victory of their nation. If ye heartily repent for your sins, you will be victorious under God's command." Now, it's pretty clear that Outlaw King's speech was written to appeal to a more modern audience, rather than to be historically authentic, which is understandable, I guess.
No.
We fight for God, for honour, for country, for family. For yourselves, I do not care, so long as you fight!
Regardless of who they were fighting for, the Scots fought magnificently. Their preparations paid off as cavalry charged into the unseen trenches, leaving knights and horses impaled on spears. Meanwhile, flanking maneuvers saw horses and men flounder in the marsh. The Scots leapt into the confusion, slaughtering as many as 100 knights. Soon, having witnessed the massacre of the vanguard, the English rearguard fled, leaving Valence no choice but to sound a retreat. It was a muddy and gory mess, and is recreated brilliantly in this movie, but one huge inaccuracy threatens to spoil everything, namely the farcically incompetent and inexplicably present Edward II.
Solid ground here!
I hear that this is, I knew this movie already. One of the reasons why I didn't watch this movie is because I had heard this very inaccurate thing, and I was like, excuse me? Some guy had, some historian had gone over this scene completely and was showing how inaccurate and accurate it was. And yeah, this kind of pissed me off for some reason.
Really, movie? Movie, you spent all that time and energy recreating one of the most authentic medieval battles portrayed on screen, and still you can't resist falling back on a smackdown between the hero and the villain.
Why?
The King of Scotland versus the King of England. Mano y mano. Not even Braveheart had the balls to pull that off. And it gets worse. Does no one even notice this is happening? Edward is wearing gold armor, for God's sake. And there's all these people just milling about while Robert is attacked. Not much of a victory if your king dies, is it? Lucky for them, Bruce is the good guy, and it's that time of the film where he puts the baddie in the dirt. So now Edward is rolling around on the ground, puking and crying. And what does Robert do? He lets him go! Robert, a man whose wife, daughter, and sisters are in English custody, lets the English king escape instead of capturing and ransoming him. That is some major bullshit there.
I know.
Do you really think the same ruthless pragmatist who switched sides in 1302, who murdered his rival in a church in 1306, and who burned down his own castles to thwart the enemy, would let this opportunity go by? He must have taken one hell of a knock to the head in that battle. No, the reason Edward wasn't captured at Loudon Hill was because he wasn't there. But regardless, Loudon Hill was definitely a turning point. However, I think the film uses it as a proxy for the later and more famous Battle of Bannockburn. After all, Edward II was at Bannockburn in June 1314. He even tried to stay on the battlefield after all was lost, much like in the movie, and had to be dragged from the field by his own knights. Also, another inaccuracy is that the body count on screen looks to be much higher than the real Loudon Hill. Just counting Robert's on-screen kills, he'd be responsible for 20% of the English dead. At Bannockburn, the English lost over 100 knights and also thousands of infantry, making it much more comparable with what we see here. Finally, it was the English prisoners taken at Bannockburn that allowed Bruce to reunite with Elizabeth in 1315, long after Loudon Hill, and a full 8 years after her capture.
The horse wanted a hug too.
Okay, so maybe I'm setting the bar a little low, and I'm no expert in medieval armor or war gear, but when I see mail and gambesons instead of kilts and blue war paint, I sigh with relief. Finally, someone is at least trying for historical accuracy here, and that even extends to the civilian clothing too, which are often colourful and clean. Nobles and clergy's clothes would have been well maintained, as would their armour, and despite what we are often shown in historical movies, medieval people loved bright colours. Sure, there's plenty of drab tones and dirt in Outlaw King, but only when it makes sense story-wise, like when Robert and his band are fugitives in hiding. Did I mention that they're not wearing kilts and actually wearing the same type of clothing as the English? Honestly, if you want to catch a glimpse of Scotland at the turn of the 14th century, this is the film you should be watching, not Braveheart. Now, maybe there's a bit more chainmail about than what you would expect, given how expensive it was. And some of it is quite loosely fitted, but then for the Scots that would make sense. Bruce and his men had to abandon a lot of their armor while on the run, so this could be an indication that theirs was looted from the dead. But that's no excuse for some of these English knights though. Even so, this is still some of the most authentic looking mail I've seen. It's a far cry from the knitted mail you get in a lot of other media, and even when it's not fitted perfectly, the visual authenticity of the material is top notch. I just wish the English looked after theirs a little better. Then there are the weapons, which are very accurate on the whole. Lots of axes and spears, which were a staple of Scottish tactics. Axes were highly effective against mail, and spearmen organized into schildtrins were great at neutralizing cavalry. This involved forming into something like a hedgehog, which horses weren't keen into running into. Overall, a big step in the right direction after Mel Gibson's two-handed sword swinging. Obviously, fire arrows are still an issue, but the shields are excellent and appropriately coloured yellow. I just wish there was more of this colour in the clothing of Scottish soldiers, as this was quite common due to easy access to yellow dye, namely horse urine. Away from the battlefield now, Elizabeth and Bruce's wedding had a proper liturgy, and the gradual way in which they grew to trust each other reflects the arranged marriage this was. The landscapes are also stunning and authentic, which makes perfect sense since the film was shot entirely in Scotland.
Wow.
That is, according to the borders of 1320. I've talked a lot about the changes the film makes to chronology, but real life doesn't read like a tight script. It's messy, repetitive, and sometimes illogical, so you have to make compromises, and it's clear the director, David Mackenzie, grappled with that.
90% of the scenes in the movie are based on sort of historical fact, or document or whatever, Obviously, it's a fictional dramatization of it, but we're leaning on the history as much as possible.
I'm sure there's an imaginary version of Outlaw King that is 5 or 10 hours long, with all the events in their proper place. But as much as I would love to see it, you just can't expect that level of accuracy. What Outlaw King does very well is to take real events, then remix, reorder, and combine them to make something that is authentic, if not entirely accurate. There was real care given to that authenticity. Even when things are made up, they're often at least pulled from a historical source. Chris Pine's Bruce strikes me as a more regal and measured character than the hot-headed pragmatist of history, but even this is a more of a distortion of time than anything else. Bruce did grow to be more kingly and level-headed over time, and this performance taps into those later years. Even so, we're talking about a Scottish hero, and the filmmakers were willing to keep his morality grayer than most Hollywood leads. I mean, can you imagine the team behind Braveheart doing that? Speaking of which, it's not really an inaccuracy, but I came across something in my research that I found just too cool not to include, and it relates to the origin of the name Braveheart. Now, William Wallace will forever be associated with it because of the movie, but it rightfully refers to Robert the Bruce. Let me explain. Bruce spent many years after Loudon Hill seeking recognition of his right to rule an independent Scotland. Meanwhile, he was still excommunicated despite repeated promises to the Pope that he would go on crusade as soon as England left Scotland alone. Unfortunately, even after his roaring victory at Bannockburn, Edward II still refused to recognize him. Then finally, Bruce got his chance. On the 20th of January 1327, Edward II was deposed by his own queen, Isabella of France, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. In his place, they crowned his 14-year-old son, Edward III. Robert exploited the instability by raiding northern England, hoping to goad them into a response. He succeeded, and when the usurpers tried to tame Scotland, the young king was almost killed in a raid led by James Douglas. In May 1328, Bruce finally got his wish. Edward III recognized him as, by God's grace, illustrious King of Scotland. Sadly, he would only enjoy success for a single year, as illness finally took him on June 7, 1329. Prior to his death, he tasked James Douglas with taking his heart on crusade. True to his word, Douglas took the heart, encased in a silver casket, into battle against the Islamic Caliphate. Legend says that as he and his men charged, Douglas threw the heart ahead of him and cried, "Onward, brave heart! Douglas should follow thee or die." And so he did, killed by the Moorish cavalry. The heart was collected after the battle and interred at Melrose Abbey. Well, that about wraps it up. My name is Nick Hodges.
That was actually really good. I really do want to watch that movie. Yeah, I think I've said all I've needed to say in this thing. But yeah, it's really unfortunate that probably the most famous version of Robert the Bruce will forever be known as a traitor, like the idiot from Braveheart, which is who actually deserves the damn name. Oh boy. But hopefully more things come out that accurately represents the Scottish turmoil against the English, because fuck the English. But anyway, what did you guys think of the movie? Are you more interested in history now? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, please smash that like button if you want to see more sexy and nerdy content, and subscribe if you think I deserve it. And I'll see you on the next video.